There's a family in Switzerland, I won't use their real name, let's call them the Beaumonts, that has been quietly wealthy for over 400 years. Not celebrity wealthy, not Forbes list wealthy, just consistently, generationally, stubbornly, silently wealthy. 400 years of wars, market crashes, revolutions, inflation, depressions, 2 world wars, and the complete digital transformation of the global economy, and this family is still standing, still comfortable, still passing something substantial down to every single generation. Now contrast that with lottery winners. Studies consistently show that over 70% of lottery winners are broke within 5 years. Not because they're stupid, not because they're lazy, but because wealth without discipline is just a countdown timer. So, what do old money families know that everyone else doesn't? It's not about inheritance, it's not about trust funds, and it's definitely not about secret investment formulas locked in Geneva vaults. It's about discipline, a very specific, very intentional, very transferable kind of discipline. 7 disciplines, actually. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand every single one of them. Let's get into it. Before we get into the disciplines themselves, we need to define what we actually mean by old money, because this term gets thrown around constantly, and almost everyone gets it wrong. Old money does not simply mean people who inherited a lot of money. That's far too simple. There are plenty of inheritance stories that end in a single generation, where a grandfather builds an empire, the children spend it down, and the grandchildren are genuinely broke. Old money means wealth that survives, wealth that compounds across multiple generations, wealth that outlasts the original wealth creator and outlasts them by centuries, not just decades. The Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Agnellis, the Pritzkers, the Cargill family. These families didn't just inherit money, they inherited a system, a set of principles, behaviors, disciplines, and invisible rules that ensured the wealth didn't evaporate when the founding generation was gone. And here's the genuinely fascinating part. Most of these disciplines have almost nothing to do with finance in the traditional sense. They're psychological, they're cultural, they're philosophical. They're about how a family thinks, communicates, and makes decisions, not just about what assets they hold. New money, and I say this with absolutely no judgment, because new money is extraordinary, tends to be visible, loud. It announces itself. It buys the mansion before the foundation is fully poured. It moves fast and celebrates big. Old money is quiet, patient, strategic. It plays a game that's almost impossible to see unless you know exactly what to look for. Today, we're going to learn how to see it. I've spent months deep in research on this topic, from academic studies on inheritance and family governance, to first-hand accounts from people raised in old money environments, to historical case studies going back to the Renaissance. I've read the work of researchers like Paul Shervish at Boston College and Dennis Jaffe, one of the foremost experts on multi-generational family wealth. I've cross-referenced data on what consistently distinguishes families, whose wealth lasts from families whose wealth disappears. And what I found wasn't a list of investment tips. What I found was something far more interesting. 7 disciplines, 7 invisible pillars, each one deceptively simple on the surface, but extraordinarily difficult to execute consistently across generations. Let's start with the first one. 1. The long game, the time horizon. Discipline, the single most powerful and least discussed discipline of old money families, is their relationship with time. And I don't mean time management in the productivity hack, morning routine sense. I mean something far deeper, their fundamental operating assumption about how long they're playing this game. Here's what I mean. When most people make a financial decision, whether to invest, spend, save, or borrow, their time horizon is almost always personal. They think about their own lifetime. Maybe they stretch to their children, almost never beyond that. Old money families operate on a completely different time scale. They think in generations, plural. Not, what does this decision mean for me? But what does this decision mean for the next 100 years of this family? This isn't a small shift in thinking. It fundamentally changes every single decision they make. Let me give you a concrete example. In 1900, the Rockefeller family created a family office structure that was explicitly designed not to maximize returns in the short term, but to preserve and intelligently grow capital across multiple generations. They deliberately sacrificed some short-term upside in exchange for consistency, stability, and longevity. Over 120 years later, with family assets still estimated in the billions across hundreds of family members, it's difficult to argue with the results. Now compare that to the average professional athlete. The average NFL career lasts about 4 to 5 years. Average earnings during that time? Several $1,000,000, often more. And yet, according to a landmark Sports Illustrated investigation, approximately 78% of NFL players face significant financial stress or bankruptcy within 2 years of retirement. Same amount of money or more, completely different outcome. The core difference? Time horizon. The 100-year test. Here's a mental model that old money families use that I've come to call the 100-year test. Before making any significant financial decision, they ask themselves, in 100 years, will this have mattered? Will this have grown? Will this have created something lasting? This test filters out almost all impulse decisions. It eliminates lifestyle inflation. It kills speculative bets. It removes ego-driven purchases. And it amplifies the things that genuinely compound across time: education, land, relationships, reputation, and systems. Think about how differently you would live if every major decision you made had to survive a 100-year filter. Would you buy the flashy car on credit? Almost certainly not. Would you invest deeply in your children's education? Absolutely and enthusiastically. Would you spend lavishly every weekend just to keep up with your social circle? No. Would you plant seeds, literal or metaphorical, that take decades to bear fruit? Yes. Every time. The 100-year test doesn't require you to be a genius. It just requires you to think further ahead than most people are willing to. The deferred gratification engine. This long-game mindset is only possible if you have a deeply embedded culture of deferred gratification. And this is something old money families actively teach from childhood. Not as a lesson, but as a value. Not save money because you should, but delay reward because the future version of you, and the children who come after you, will benefit more from patience than you will from pleasure today. This is fundamentally different from how most of us grew up with money. Most of us were taught to earn money and enjoy it. Old money children are taught to earn money, preserve it, grow it carefully, and pass it forward in better condition than they received it. There's a famous experiment from Stanford, the marshmallow study, conducted in the late 1960s and 70s. Children were offered 1 marshmallow immediately, or 2 marshmallows if they could wait 15 minutes. The children who waited went on to show higher academic achievement, better health outcomes, and stronger financial trajectories in adulthood. Old money families don't leave deferred gratification to willpower or chance. They build it into culture, into ritual, into expectation, into the very stories they tell their children about who the family is and what it stands for. The compounding of non-financial assets. Here's something most people miss entirely about the long-game discipline. Old money families understand that non-financial assets compound, too. Reputation compounds. A family known for integrity and fair dealing doesn't just win deals once. They get called first for every significant deal for generations, because the name carries accumulated weight and implicit trust. Knowledge compounds. A family that invests in deep education across 3 generations doesn't just have one well-educated member. They have a dynasty of thinkers, strategists, and adaptive problem solvers who can navigate any economic environment, regardless of what changes around them. Relationships compound. A network built carefully over decades becomes a dense web of trust, opportunity, and mutual benefit that no single wealthy individual could replicate by themselves, regardless of how much capital they have. Old money families invest in all of these consistently, quietly, and deliberately because they understand that the compound interest on reputation or relationships is just as powerful and often more durable than the compound interest on capital. Here's the uncomfortable truth about the long game, though. It requires you to accept that many of your most important investments will never benefit you personally. You'll plant trees whose shade you'll never sit under. You'll build institutions that will far outlive you. You'll make sacrifices whose full payoff will come to people who haven't been born yet. Most of us, and I include myself honestly here, find that deeply difficult. We are psychologically wired for immediate feedback. We want to see the results. We want the validation now. Old money families across generations have trained themselves to find meaning in the act of building, not just the reward of receiving. That psychological shift may be the most important discipline of all 7. 2. Financial education. As family culture. Ask yourself this question honestly. When you were growing up, how often did your family openly discuss money? Not during a crisis, not when there was a problem, but just naturally, as a normal part of dinner conversation. For the vast majority of people, the answer is rarely, if ever. Money was a private topic. Adults handled it. Children were shielded from it. It was almost considered impolite to discuss. In old money families, the opposite is true. Financial education isn't a subject you study. It's a culture you're born into. It starts before children can count, and it never, ever stops. The dinner table curriculum. In the 1980s, sociologist Annette Lareau conducted groundbreaking research on how different families raise their children, what she called concerted cultivation versus natural growth. What she found wasn't just about schooling or discipline. It was about what families consider worthy of conversation. In multi-generational affluent families specifically, dinner tables were forums for intellectual and financial discourse. Children heard adults discuss property valuations, business challenges, investment philosophy, economic cycles, and the long-term implications of major decisions. Not in a formal classroom way, just naturally, as part of the texture of daily life. By the time those children were teenagers, they had absorbed an entire financial vocabulary and framework almost without realizing it. When they eventually sat across from a financial advisor, took over a business interest, or managed a trust, they weren't starting from zero. They were continuing a conversation that had been going on their entire lives. Most of us start from zero, and that gap, that starting point deficit, is enormous, not because of intelligence, because of exposure. The apprenticeship model. Old money families don't just talk about money, they apprentice their children into it. The Agnelli family in Italy, the founding dynasty behind fiat, famously began introducing their children to the business when they were barely teenagers. Not as passengers, but as active participants. They attended board meetings. They were expected to ask intelligent questions. They were given real exposure to how enterprise decisions were made and why. This apprenticeship model appears in virtually every multi-generational wealth case study I've researched. The children aren't just told about money, they're given small doses of real responsibility early enough that it becomes normal. A trust account with a small monthly distribution that the child is responsible for managing and accounting for. A small investment account where the child makes real decisions with real, though small, consequences. A family business task that teaches supply chains, margins, and relationships between cost and value. The lesson isn't the specific knowledge, it's the habit of thinking about money with intentionality and accountability. It's learning viscerally that money is not a reward to be consumed. It's a tool to be deployed thoughtfully. The vocabulary of wealth. There's a fascinating linguistic dimension to old money financial education that doesn't get nearly enough attention. These families develop over generations a shared vocabulary around wealth, and that vocabulary profoundly shapes how every family member thinks about it. Words like stewardship. You don't own this wealth outright. You are currently caretaking it for the next generation. Principle, the core capital that must never be eroded. Only the growth is available to spend. Deployment, money isn't saved passively. It's actively placed where it will multiply. Legacy, every significant decision is evaluated through the lens of what it leaves behind. These aren't just nice words. They are cognitive anchors. When a teenager hears their parents naturally use the word stewardship in conversation about finances, they begin to internalize a completely different relationship with wealth. It's not entirely theirs to consume. It's theirs to tend, to grow, and to pass forward. That single word, stewardship, contains an entire philosophy of wealth management. And children raised hearing it absorb that philosophy effortlessly, while children not raised hearing it may never encounter it at all. Financial education versus financial wisdom. I want to draw an important distinction here: the difference between financial literacy and financial wisdom. Financial literacy is knowing how an index fund works, understanding compound interest, being able to balance a budget. These are important skills, genuinely useful. Financial education, as practiced by old money families, goes much deeper. It's a value system. It's an understanding of why certain choices are made, not just how. It includes the emotional and psychological dimensions of wealth, how to handle a sudden windfall, how to navigate family members with their hand out, how to resist the psychological traps of affluence, entitlement, complacency, the loss of hunger. Schools can teach financial literacy. Old money families teach financial wisdom, and there is a vast consequential difference between the two. Now here's where this gets genuinely uncomfortable. Financial education as a family culture is, by its very nature, self-reinforcing and compounding. The families that practice it get better at it, generation by generation. The families that don't even if they accumulate significant wealth, are always starting over. This is not a commentary on intelligence or worthiness. It's a comment on systems. Families that build systems for transferring financial wisdom consistently outperform families that rely on individual initiative alone. Every time, without exception. The question for you, and I want you to sit with this, is what is the financial culture in your family right now? What conversations are happening at your dinner table? What vocabulary are your children absorbing? Because you may not have old money today, but you can build an old money culture starting tonight. 3. Stewardship over ownership. This next discipline is subtle, almost philosophical, but I believe it may be the single most psychologically powerful of all 7. It comes down to one deceptively simple question. Do you own your wealth, or are you stewarding it? The difference sounds philosophical, but it has profound, measurable, generational consequences. When you believe you own your wealth, the implicit story is, it's mine. I earned it. I deserve it. I get to decide what to do with it. When you believe you are stewarding your wealth, the implicit story is, I am the current guardian of something that belongs to a lineage. My job is to protect it, grow it, and hand it off in better condition than I found it. These two mental frameworks produce completely different behavior across every financial decision. The ownership mindset in practice. The ownership mindset says, I worked hard for this. I deserve to enjoy the fruits of my labor. And honestly, that's not wrong in isolation. Enjoyment is entirely legitimate. Quality of life matters. But taken to its logical extreme, pure ownership thinking leads to what economists call intergenerational wealth destruction, where each generation consumes more than it grows, and the wealth contracts with every transfer. Consider the old proverb, in English, rags to rags in 3 generations. In Chinese culture, rice paddy to rice paddy in 3 generations. In Japanese, the 3rd generation ruins the house. In Italian, from the stalls to the stars to the stalls. Nearly every major culture on earth has a version of this proverb because it describes a real, documented, remarkably consistent pattern. The first generation earns the wealth through hard work, sacrifice, and often genuine suffering. The second generation witnesses the work up close. They respect it. They're careful. The third generation inherits without context. They never saw the struggle. They don't feel the weight of stewardship. And slowly, reliably, they consume. Old money families that break this cycle do so by engineering stewardship into the DNA of the family culture. The wealth isn't yours to consume freely. It's a responsibility to be honored. Structural stewardship, family governance. One of the most fascinating dimensions of old money families is how seriously they take formal governance structures. We're talking about family constitutions, written documents, sometimes dozens of pages long, that explicitly articulate the family's values, mission, operating philosophy, and rules around wealth. These documents address questions like, how are major investment and divestment decisions made? What are the criteria for distributing income from family trusts? How does the family handle disputes between members? What obligations do family members have in exchange for access to shared family wealth? What happens when a family member's individual decisions threaten the collective? This level of formality would seem bizarre, even paranoid, to most families. But to old money families, it's simply normal operating procedure. Because they understand that without structure, individual human psychology, The very human desire to consume more, to take more, to behave like an owner rather than a steward, will erode even the largest fortune over time. The stewardship of non-financial assets. Stewardship also extends powerfully to non-financial assets, and this is another area where old money families consistently and quietly outperform. The family home, the family name, the family reputation. These are stewarded with exactly the same care as the financial capital. In many old money families, a primary family estate is considered not a personal asset, but a family asset. No single generation owns it. They occupy it. They maintain it. They improve it where appropriate. And they pass it on in better condition than they received it. But more importantly, the family name is stewarded with the same fierce intentionality as the family balance sheet. Old money families are deeply protective of their reputation, not out of vanity or social climbing, because they understand at a visceral level that a compromised name destroys access to the networks, opportunities, and trust that multi-generational wealth absolutely depends on. One scandal, one fraud, one very public failure of character or judgment, and centuries of reputation building can dissolve in a matter of months. Old money families have seen this happen to others. They carry that awareness with them into every significant decision they make. The stewardship mindset does have a real shadow side, though, and I think it's worth naming honestly. Taken to an extreme, stewardship can harden into rigidity. Families that are too bound to their traditions can catastrophically fail to adapt to changing environments. The industrial dynasty that refuses to acknowledge technology. The real estate family that can't respond to new urban patterns. The investment office locked in the strategies of a previous generation. The best old money families navigate this brilliantly. They preserve the principles while continuously adapting the strategies. They keep the why while updating the how, and maintaining that balance between honoring what works and evolving what doesn't is itself an art form that must be consciously practiced in every generation. 4. Strategic privacy. Old money is quiet. If you've ever spent real time around genuinely multi-generational wealthy families, one of the first things you notice is how conspicuously little they talk about their wealth. No flashy cars parked on the street, no designer logos front and center, no Instagram posts from the fourth vacation property, no announcements at dinner about the size of the deal they just closed. This isn't modesty for its own sake. It isn't self-consciousness. It is a carefully cultivated, deliberately practiced, highly strategic discipline of privacy. And it may be one of the most important and most consistently underestimated disciplines on this entire list. Why old money stays silent. There's a practical dimension to strategic privacy that goes far deeper than simple humility. Visibility attracts threats. When you display wealth publicly and consistently, you become a target for lawsuits, for social manipulation, for family members who feel entitled to a share, for bad investment pitches dressed up as once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, for people who want to use your wealth rather than build a genuine relationship with you. Historically, in parts of Europe and Latin America, wealthy families began employing private security and adopting deliberately low-profile lifestyles, precisely because conspicuous wealth made them and their families physically vulnerable. Kidnapping for ransom was a genuine threat for visibly wealthy families, in a way it simply wasn't for discreet ones. Beyond the security dimension, there's a profound social one. When you loudly display wealth, you invite comparisons, resentment, and people who are primarily interested in what you can give them. Old money families understand what new money is often still discovering, showing wealth is expensive and not just financially. It costs you time, authenticity, genuine relationships, and decision-making freedom. Signal versus noise. Here's a framework I want you to hold on to. I call it signal versus noise. In any social environment, there are two kinds of wealth communication. Noise, the visible, loud, overt signals. The mansion, the sports car, the first-class upgrades loudly mentioned, the bottle service at a nightclub, the watch you make sure people notice. Noise is designed to be seen. It performs for an audience. Signal, the understated, calibrated, covert communication. The watch from a respected but quiet maker that only certain people would recognize. The easy mention of a private club that means nothing to most people, but everything to the right ones. The effortless manner that comes from a lifetime of genuine security rather than performed success. Old money speaks in signal. New money often speaks in noise. And here's why it matters beyond social dynamics. The people worth knowing in old money circles are often actively repelled by noise. They find it unsophisticated. It signals insecurity, and insecurity is not a quality they want in a business partner, a family connection, or a trusted advisor. So, the very performance of wealth that's designed to attract success ends up pushing away the most valuable relationships. Privacy as financial strategy. Strategic privacy has a direct, measurable financial dimension too. When you are not publicly known to be wealthy, you negotiate from a different position. You can walk into a deal without the other party knowing exactly the depth of your resources. And that information asymmetry creates leverage. When you are not loudly wealthy, you attract people who are genuinely interested in you, in your ideas, your character, your judgment, rather than people primarily interested in what you can do for them financially. When you are not performing wealth, you are free to make financial decisions based purely on merit, not on the need to maintain an image. You can drive an ordinary car. You can live in an understated house. You can pass on a flashy but fundamentally weak investment, even if accepting it would look impressive at a dinner party. That freedom from performance is not just psychologically liberating. It's genuinely and quantifiably profitable over a lifetime. Here's the tension I want to name plainly. Strategic privacy runs directly counter to how modern social media and personal branding culture tells us to operate. Every productivity guru, every brand consultant, every monetization coach says, build in public, show your lifestyle, be aspirational, attract your audience. And for certain business models, content creation, personal brand businesses, that visibility serves a real strategic purpose. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying be intentional, be strategic, know exactly what you're showing, why you're showing it, and who you're showing it to. Default to discretion. Let visibility be a deliberate choice with a clear purpose, not a reflexive, habitual performance of status. Because the most powerful people in almost every room are often the ones you don't immediately notice. 5. The discipline of no, anti-lifestyle inflation. Here is possibly the most counterintuitive thing I'm going to say in this entire video. Old money families consistently spend less than new money families, often dramatically less, as a percentage of their wealth. Not because they can't afford to spend more. They absolutely can. But because they've built an ironclad, culturally reinforced, psychologically sophisticated discipline around saying no to lifestyle inflation. What lifestyle inflation actually is. Lifestyle inflation is the pattern where, as income rises, spending automatically rises to match or exceed it. It's the reflexive upgrade, the bigger house every time you earn more, the nicer car after the promotion, the more expensive vacation as soon as the bonus hits. It feels natural, it feels earned, and it is one of the most reliable predictors of long-term wealth stagnation. The wealthy families researchers have studied that lose their wealth across generations almost always show the same behavioral pattern. Each generation spends more than the previous one, not because they earn significantly more, but because their sense of what is normal and appropriate keeps rising with their social environment. They compare upward. They want what their most successful peers have. They feel entitled to comfort and luxury as their baseline. And slowly, relentlessly, the wealth is consumed faster than it's grown. The old money reference point. Old money families manage this with something subtle but profoundly effective. They deliberately calibrate their reference point. They do not primarily compare themselves to other wealthy people. They compare themselves to the standard they've explicitly set for themselves, which is almost always deliberately, intentionally modest relative to their actual wealth. This is why many old money families are famous for driving the same unremarkable cars for decades after they could effortlessly replace them, for keeping the same unpretentious family home for generations rather than continuously upgrading, for wearing worn jackets and comfortable old shoes, not because they can't afford better, but because they genuinely see no need for the performance. Warren Buffett, who, while technically self-made, has studied and mirrors old money operating principles more closely than almost anyone, still lives in the house he bought in Omaha, Nebraska in 1958 for $31,500. His current net worth exceeds $100 billion. The house is not a statement of inability. It is a statement of discipline, a deliberate, consistent, daily refusal to let lifestyle expansion consume capital that is compounding. The enough framework. Old money families operate with a concept that is genuinely alien to modern consumer culture, the concept of enough. There is a level of comfort, security, and quality of life that is genuinely sufficient. That is deeply satisfying, and once you reach it, the marginal return on additional spending, on the larger house, the more exotic car, the more expensive wine, approaches zero in terms of actual well-being. Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill. We adapt to every new level of comfort with remarkable speed, and that comfort quickly becomes the baseline, the new normal, requiring yet another upgrade to achieve the same feeling of satisfaction. Old money families, across generations, develop a cultural resistance to the hedonic treadmill. Not through deprivation, they live well, but through a conscious, repeated, celebrated choice to stop running. The practical mechanics. How do they actually implement this? Here are the specific mechanisms I've identified. First, they separate income from spending decisions. Rather than spending what's available, they define a lifestyle budget that genuinely meets their needs. And then the rest is automatically invested first, before any discretionary spending can claim it. Second, they create deliberate friction between desire and purchase. Old money families often maintain cooling-off periods for any significant discretionary purchase. A week minimum, often a month or more. The impulse fades. The item is evaluated with entirely clear eyes. Most of the time, the purchase simply doesn't happen. Third, they make opportunity cost visceral and concrete through family education. Every dollar spent on a status symbol is a dollar that won't compound for 30, 50, or 100 years. When you genuinely feel that opportunity cost, not just understand it intellectually, but feel it, the purchase becomes far less appealing. Here's the brutal paradox I want you to sit with. The families with the most wealth often live the most modestly, and the families with the least wealth often spend the most conspicuously. This is not just ironic, it is causal. The modest living is one of the core reasons the wealthy have so much, and the conspicuous spending is one of the core reasons the others have so little. The path to generational wealth is quite literally paved with no. 6. The network as infrastructure. Old money families don't just have good networks. They view their network as a core financial asset, as important as their investment portfolio, their real estate holdings, or their business interests. And they invest in it with precisely the same intentionality. Relationships as capital. There's a concept in sociology called social capital, and it is one of the most consequential and least discussed forces in wealth creation. Social capital refers to the value embedded in relationships, the trust, the reciprocity, the flow of quality information, and the access to opportunities that comes from being genuinely and deeply connected to the right people. Old money families have been building social capital for generations, and just like financial capital, it compounds. A great-grandfather who was a trusted partner in a significant transaction doesn't just benefit himself, he creates a relationship that his children inherit as a kind of warm introduction. His grandchildren are presented to the second generation of that family with an implicit endorsement carrying real weight. Your grandfather and mine built something together. That introduction opens doors that would simply never open for a stranger regardless of how much money they had. Multiply this dynamic across dozens of deep relationships, compounded across multiple generations, and you begin to understand why old money families seem to effortlessly access opportunities that others fight desperately to reach. They're not smarter, they're not luckier, they're inheriting infrastructure that's been built and maintained for a very long time. The architecture of old money networks. Old money networks are not random. They are carefully, consciously structured around institutions that endure. Elite schools, private clubs, charitable boards, family offices, professional associations, and yes, strategic marriages. These aren't casual social activities. They're infrastructure decisions. When an old money family sends their children to a particular school or university, they're not just buying an education, though that matters too. They're buying 40 to 50 years of connection to a cohort of people who will go on to hold influential positions across business, law, government, finance, and culture. The classroom is real, the credential is useful, but the network, the lifetime of trust and familiarity built with the people sitting in those classrooms, is the primary investment. Private clubs exist for the same reason. They're not about prestige or exclusion for its own sake. They're about curated access to a community of people with aligned values, significant resources, and long operating time horizons. The conversations that happen in those environments, the relationships formed over years of recurring contact, are worth more than almost anything money can directly purchase. Charitable board memberships serve a dual purpose that old money families understand implicitly. They express genuine philanthropic commitment while simultaneously placing the family in ongoing proximity to other influential, purpose-driven leaders. Relationships built around shared values and shared purpose tend to be deeper and more durable than relationships built around business transactions alone. The ethics of old money networking. Here's something that consistently surprises people who study old money networks closely. They are deeply relational, but never explicitly transactional. Old money families give before they ask. They contribute, introduce, facilitate, support, and add value without explicit expectation of immediate return. They understand at a deep, cultural level that the most valuable relationships are built on a foundation of genuine generosity, and that the return, when it naturally comes, will be multiples of what they invested. This stands in sharp contrast to the networking behavior most people experience. The conference circuit, the LinkedIn connection with an immediate pitch, the relationship that exists purely for extraction. Old money networking is slow, personal, built on genuine shared history, mutual trust, and real affection, constructed over years and decades, not weeks. Precisely because it's slow and authentic, it is almost impossible to replicate quickly. It cannot be hacked or shortcut. It requires the long game, which again brings us right back to Discipline 1. The hard truth about old money networks is that they are, by design, difficult to enter from outside, and that exclusivity carries real ethical complexity that I don't want to paper over. But the deeper lesson is this: the principles of old money networking are available to absolutely anyone. Long-term thinking, giving value first, anchoring relationships in institutions and shared purposes, stewarding relationships like assets, pruning the network of people who consistently take without contributing. You cannot replicate overnight the decades of history an old money family carries, but you can start building your own history today, and every generation that passes adds more depth, more trust, and more compound value to what you're building. 7. Boring investments win. We've arrived at the 7th discipline, and in some ways, it's the most anticlimactic, which is entirely the point. Old money families don't invest in exciting things. They invest in boring things, and they do it with absolute, unflinching, multi-generational consistency. The excitement premium. Here's a concept I want to introduce: the excitement premium. When people invest, they instinctively pay more in time, attention, emotion, and capital for investments that are exciting. Hot startups, trending technologies, speculative assets, emerging markets with great stories attached to them. And sometimes those exciting investments deliver extraordinary returns. The stories get told and retold. But studies of actual investor behavior consistently show that the average investor in exciting, volatile assets significantly underperforms the average investor in boring, stable assets, even in cases where the exciting assets have higher headline returns. Why? Because of behavior. Because we are far more likely to panic sell a volatile investment during a downturn than a boring one. Because exciting portfolios consume vastly more mental energy and decision-making bandwidth. Because volatility creates cascading opportunity costs that compound against us over time. Old money families have absorbed this lesson across generations, not through theory, through lived experience of watching exciting investments disappoint far more consistently than boring ones. And they've developed a deep cultural bias toward predictability, durability, and simplicity. The core asset classes. Walk through the portfolios of most multi-generational wealthy families, and you find remarkable consistency. Land and real estate, arguably the original store of value. For millennia, land has been the most reliable preserver of purchasing power in human civilization. It doesn't disappear in a crash. It can be farmed, developed, leased, or simply held. In virtually every old money lineage I've studied, real estate, particularly income-producing land, features prominently and consistently. Ownership stakes in durable businesses, not hot startups, but established enterprises with proven cash flows, durable competitive advantages, and long operating histories. Family-owned businesses in sectors like food, healthcare, utilities, financial services, and real estate. Businesses that generate reliable cash flow across economic cycles and decades of changing conditions. Passive equity ownership, owning a diversified piece of the entire productive economy as cheaply and simply as possible, held essentially forever. This is a more recent vehicle, but the underlying principle is entirely consistent with old money philosophy. Buy durable, broadly diversified assets, minimize costs and friction, and hold through everything. Alternative hard assets, art from established artists, timber, farmland, precious metals, assets that hold purchasing power across economic disruptions, that are not correlated with paper markets, and that have served as stores of value across centuries of human civilization. What you consistently will not find in old money portfolios: concentrated speculative bets on single companies or themes, leverage used for speculation, the investment trend everyone is currently talking about, or assets whose value depends primarily on the greater fool theory. The mathematics of boring here is the mathematics that changes everything. I want you to absorb this fully because it's the engine behind everything we've discussed today. $100,000 invested at 10% per year for 30 years grows to approximately $1.74 million. $100,000 invested at 7% per year for 30 years grows to approximately $761,000. Now here's the critical insight. The 10% scenario generally requires intense active management, considerable expertise, high stress, significant risk, and a meaningful degree of luck. And the actual average realized return for active retail investors, after costs, taxes, fees, and the inevitable behavioral mistakes, is frequently below 7%. The 7% scenario, boring diversified holdings held through every crash and recovery, never touched in panic, has been historically achievable, reliably, without genius, without timing, without a network of financial insiders. And if you extend the time horizon to 50 years, to 100 years, across multiple generations compounding toward the same long-term goals, the numbers become almost incomprehensibly large. Old money families invest quietly and consistently for generations, and the mathematics of compound growth does the heavy lifting that no amount of excitement or speculative brilliance can match. The anti-FOMO muscle 1. Final component of boring investment discipline deserves real attention. Old money families have collectively built what I call an anti-FOMO muscle. FOMO, fear of missing out, is one of the single most expensive emotional states in investing. When an asset class delivers extraordinary headline returns, FOMO says, "Get in now before it's too late." When a friend makes a killing on a speculative bet, FOMO says, "Why aren't you doing that?" Old money families have largely neutralized FOMO through cultural conditioning, not through individual willpower. They don't need to participate in every exciting opportunity because they are fundamentally not measuring their success against the market or against their peers. They measure their success against their own multi-generational goals. If the goal is to preserve and grow wealth meaningfully for the next 100 years, then missing the latest speculative boom is entirely irrelevant. The stable real estate portfolio and the quietly compounding diversified equity position will outlast and outperform the speculation. Every time, across every generation, without exception. The anti-FOMO muscle is built through family culture, through the retelling of cautionary stories about what speculation did to other families, through mentorship from older generations who've personally witnessed full market cycles, through a clear and consistently articulated family investment philosophy that makes any significant deviation feel genuinely wrong rather than tempting. Here's the challenging question I want to leave you with on this chapter. If boring investments win consistently, reliably, and demonstrably, why doesn't everyone do it? Because boring doesn't feel like enough. Because we can't resist the extraordinary return stories. Because our egos want to believe we have an edge that others lack. Because patience is genuinely, physically hard, and boring requires a tremendous amount of it. Old money families don't resist this psychology through individual willpower. They resist it through system, through culture, through the accumulated wisdom of people who have personally seen, generation after generation, what happens when you abandon the boring path for the exciting one. That is the actual lesson. The system that compounds. Now here's where everything comes together, and it's the insight I most want you to carry away from this video. These 7 disciplines don't work in isolation. They work as a system, and their extraordinary power comes entirely from how they reinforce and amplify each other. The long game mindset, Discipline 1, makes financial education, Discipline 2, feel genuinely worth investing in, because when you think in generations, you can feel how wisdom compounds across them. Financial education as culture, Discipline 2, creates the vocabulary and conceptual framework that makes stewardship, Discipline 3, possible, because you can only genuinely steward what you deeply understand. Stewardship, Discipline 3, naturally reinforces strategic privacy, Discipline 4, because when you see wealth as something you're tending for generations, rather than something you own outright, you instinctively become protective and discreet about it. Strategic privacy, Discipline 4, enables anti-lifestyle inflation, Discipline 5, because when you're not performing wealth for an external audience, there is no social pressure to spend conspicuously. Anti-lifestyle inflation, Discipline 5, frees up capital that powers boring investments, Discipline 7, because wealth that isn't consumed is available to compound undisturbed for decades and generations. And threading through all of it, the network, Discipline 6, acts as an accelerant, providing opportunities, knowledge, protection, and access that multiplies the effectiveness of every other discipline in ways that capital alone simply cannot. This is what I mean when I say old money families have a system, not a checklist, not a loosely related collection of habits, a deeply integrated, mutually reinforcing, culturally embedded operating system for multi-generational wealth. And here's the most important thing I can tell you today. You don't need to have been born into old money to build this system. You can construct it deliberately and consistently, starting right now, in your own life, with your own family, from wherever you are today. Will it pay off immediately for you? Probably not in full. Will it meaningfully benefit your children? Yes, significantly. Will it powerfully shape the lives of your grandchildren? Enormously. You won't see the full fruit of it in your own lifetime. That's the entire point. But somewhere, a generation or two from now, a member of your family will look back and identify the moment when the culture shifted, when someone, perhaps you, perhaps reading this transcript, at this very moment, decided to start playing the long game. Before we close out, I want to give you something concrete, something you can actually do starting this week. I call it the 30-day old money audit. 7 questions, one for each discipline, not to judge where you are, to identify your single biggest opportunity. Discipline 1, time. Horizon. When you make financial decisions, what's the longest time frame you naturally consider? If it's shorter than 10 years, that's your first work to do. Try this exercise. Write a short letter to your grandchild, explaining the financial decisions you're making right now and why. That single act will shift your perspective more powerfully than almost anything else you could do. Discipline 2, financial education. Have one intentional money conversation with your family this week. Not a crisis conversation, a planning conversation. What do we own? Why do we own it? What are we building toward? Begin normalizing the topic. Discipline 3, stewardship. Answer this question in writing. What am I building that is larger than my own enjoyment of it? If you don't have a clear, satisfying answer, that is your most important work right now. Discipline 4, strategic privacy. Audit your social media presence from the last 90 days. How much of what you posted was wealth performance, showing off, signaling status? How much served a genuine strategic purpose? You don't need to change everything overnight. Just become more intentional about every post going forward. Discipline 5, anti-lifestyle inflation. Calculate your personal lifestyle inflation rate. How much did your spending increase over the last 2 years compared to your income increase? If spending is growing faster than income, you are on the wrong side of the equation, and compound interest is working against you. Discipline 6, network infrastructure. Map your 5 most important professional relationships. Are they deepening? Are they genuinely reciprocal? Are they aligned with your long-term direction? Identify one person you want to invest more real time and attention in over the next 30 days, and make the first move this week. Discipline 7, boring investments. Review your portfolio honestly. What percentage is in boring, diversified, long-term positions? What percentage is genuinely speculative? If the speculative portion is keeping you up at night, that anxiety is data. Act on it. None of these require a certain income level or a minimum net worth to begin. All of them require genuine commitment, and any single one of them, practiced consistently over years, will meaningfully move the needle of your financial trajectory. Here's what I want to leave you with. The families that have sustained wealth across centuries are not defined by the money. The money, as significant as it is an outcome. What defines them is a set of values about time, about responsibility, about education, about relationships, about knowing when you have enough. Those values would make them remarkable families, even without the wealth. The wealth is what happens when those values are practiced consistently, generation after generation. The discipline comes first, the wealth follows. That sequence, discipline first, wealth second, is the hidden truth that almost nobody in the personal finance space talks about. Not because they don't know it, but because it doesn't sell a quick fix or a shortcut or a course that promises transformation in 30 days. But it is the truth, and it is accessible to every single person watching this video, regardless of where you're starting from. You may not have been born into old money, but there is absolutely nothing stopping you from building an old money culture. starting with yourself, starting with your family, starting with a single conversation tonight. That is the real inheritance. Not the money, the discipline. If this video gave you something genuinely useful, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not for my numbers, but because the people in your life who are serious about building something real deserve to have this conversation too. And if you want to go deeper on the psychology of wealth, the specific mechanics of generational financial planning, the investment frameworks old money families have refined over centuries, subscribe and stay close. We go deep on every single video here. No shortcuts, no fluff, just the real work. I'll see you in the next one.